Hi everybody, it's Maria from cardbomb.blogspot.com, and today we will be making a fun watercolor background using only 3 colors of ink. Start with a piece of watercolor paper and run your embossing buddy over it to remove any static cling. Grab your Versamark ink and ink up your stamp. I'm using a stamp that I'm going to stamp 2 times today in order to fill up this sheet of paper. There will be a gap in the center of the paper as the stamp isn't large enough to cover the whole thing. I'm using gold embossing powder. I did one side at a time, covered the second side, flicked to get any excess powder off, and heat set my powder. Now I'm using Pacific Point, and I'm starting by using my aqua painter to get a good coating of water over the background piece. Then I'm slowly adding my color in, and I'm going to try and get darker color at the bottom and go a little bit lighter as I get in towards the middle of my panel. My next color is Berry Burst. I'm going to start by mixing the Berry Burst with some of that Pacific Point, and as I get up a little bit higher I keep the Berry Burst a little bit more pure. Berry Burst does tend to have a little bit of a brown color as it breaks down when you watercolor with it, and I wanted the color where it meets with the Pacific Point to be more of a purpley blue color. So I went ahead and I heat set my color a little bit more so that I could mix the colors again. I added a deeper bit of Pacific Point at the bottom, and then I added more to that middle area where the 2 colors meet, and you can see that it's changing to a really pretty purple color. When watercoloring, you want to remember that it's easier to add more layers of color once the first layer is dry. So if your paper is still wet and you're adding more color, it's just going to keep blending and blending and blending. If you take the time to dry it or let it dry, you can add more layers and get depth more easily. I hadn't planned this, but as I was watercoloring, I decided that I would add some deeper color into some of the details of this design, and I really like the way that turned out. So here I am adding more Pacific Point into the details just to make some of them pop. Thank goodness it turned out well, because it really was unplanned. I'm adding a bit more water since some of that area up there has dried. And I'm moving now to the top of my paper. I'm going to do Berry Burst to try and continue it on from the bottom. And don't worry about that strip in the middle. The background stamp, again, I stamped it twice, but it wasn't quite big enough to cover my entire piece of paper. So I left that spot in the middle empty, and we'll cover it with a piece of ribbon towards the end of the project. You saw just now when I used my heat tool that I flip my paper over. Sometimes it's really helpful to dry the paper from the back side. It not only helps dry out your paper, but it does help with warping as well. My third color today is Daffodil Delight. You can see that I've already got a good layer on, and I'm starting to mix it in with the Berry Burst. I love the way that it mixes with the Berry Burst and sort of makes some peachy, orangey tones. And again, I'm adding more Berry Burst because I want it to look like berries instead of a little bit brown as it does sometimes when you watercolor with it. I do really like to use gold embossing when I watercolor. I just feel like it pops out so beautifully from behind the colors. And here I am going back in with the Berry Burst to add detail into some of those, some of the parts of the design from the stamp. It really does help pop those parts of the design out. You notice I did try to keep the colors isolated, so on the Pacific Point part I used Pacific Point, and as the colors transitioned between Pacific Point into that kind of purpley, I didn't do too many highlighted areas. Over here on the Berry Burst I'm going to do the same. Keep the Berry Burst more or less into the Berry Burst area. And I decided that this area was too big of a seam that didn't really mesh, so I added a little bit more Berry Burst and tried to make that transition a little bit smoother. And here we go, finally adding in some Daffodil Delight to the details to make this last part of the card pop. And I will go back in just a minute and finish some more details on the opposite side with the berry burst. A little bit darker Daffodil Delight on this side, a little more detail. Now I'm going back in with Berry Burst again. Now that that center area is a little bit drier, I can do that without having the colors blend together. And I flipped my card around and I'm using some Berry Burst on the opposite side again. Really like seeing the way that these colors contrast and blend. Really makes a big difference depending on how much color saturation you decide to add. As you can see, this is really quite an easy project. Mixing and blending some of the colors and adding some details. I'm going to add the ribbon across that center piece. I used Fast Fuse to adhere it, and on the back side I like to put glue dots just to keep those ends in tight so they don't slip out. I always like to use Fast Fuse whenever I watercolor, and I put it all over the back. This is really helpful if you have any warping in your watercolor paper. It really tacks it down well and you don't end up seeing the warping. My sentiment is again heat embossed in gold, and I added some black rhinestones. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you're interested in purchasing any of the products that I've used, there's a link in the description below. Until next time, have an amazing day.